Steve Blass pitched in the major leagues in the late 60s and early 70s. His prime was probably between 1968 and 1972. In 1971, he pitched 2 complete game victories in the World Series, helping the Pittsburgh Pirates beat the Baltimore Orioles. One of those complete game victories was in Game 7. He was an all-star, he was a control pitcher, and then in 1973, he suddenly, inexplicably forgot how to pitch. In 1974, he moved down to the minor leagues, hoping to get it back, but he never could. In 1975, he left baseball completely. He ultimately would become quite a well-known baseball announcer, but in 1975, he left baseball to sell jewelry. Roger Angell, the great baseball writer, wrote a piece about it in The New Yorker. But without a doubt, the best thing ever written about what is now known as the Steve Blass Disease was also, coincidentally, published in 1975, although the book was started in 1972, a memoir, written by Pat Jordan called A False Spring. I think it is currently published by Bison Books, a branch of the University of Nebraska Press. Pat Jordan experienced what is now known as the Steve Blass Disease in 1962, when he lost it in the minor leagues. He was perhaps more talented than Steve Blass. He certainly threw harder. He was a prospect since he was 12 years old. But he completely broke down and lost it in the minor leagues. He writes at the beginning of this book that it was happening in his mind, not in his arm. I am fascinated by the Steve Blass Disease because perhaps I experienced bouts of it when I played basketball, when, like, suddenly when I was under pressure, I would forget how to dribble. I would be afraid that the ball would not come back up to my hand, and it wouldn't sometimes. It's this experience or condition where perhaps after years of enduring pressure, you have a kind of nervous breakdown that manifests itself in the body and mind suddenly forgetting how to do something that was once second nature. Quite a few pitchers have experienced it, and infielders and outfielders too. And I think athletes in all sports, and even I have an acquaintance here in Seville who at one time was in a very, very well-known and respected classical music orchestra here in Europe as a clarinetist, and then just one day suddenly forgot how to play the instrument. Okay? So perhaps I am personally inclined to a book like this, but no. I mean, this book is special. It's also about identity. Because at one point he says, I was my talent. The loss of it was a loss of self. He talks about how pitching was the first thing in his life that he could do well that others couldn't. And how losing that talent was perhaps an experience that affected his life to a degree that nothing else ever will. That's the way he puts it. He's still alive. He's 81 years old. This book, he says at the start, is an attempt not to relive the experience, but to re-see it, although we get a chance to relive it with him. He grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut. Got a $46,000 bonus in 1958 when he was 19 or 18 years old. The Milwaukee Braves also paid for college, or I guess that was part of the bonus. Part of the bonus was also the monthly stipend he got when he played in the minor leagues. And he was a huge disappointment to the organization, but mostly to himself. And that's what makes the book fascinating. It is one of my favorite books of all time. I finished it and went right back into it. Read it again from beginning to end. And I've read it twice more since then. once for this review. I guess nowadays people would say that it's a book that tells on itself, meaning that the author reveals things almost inadvertently or accidentally. I think authors can sometimes do that. I think that, their mistakes reveal them to us. But I don't think that anything that Pat Jordan did in this book was a mistake. I think that, what he did was have the guts to let the book lead him wherever it was going to lead him. He just lays himself completely bare, digs really, really deep, scares up all these demons, goes deep into his bitterness, into his regret, recalls his hysteria and desperation, and just lays it all out there open for interpretation. I think that's a completely admirable thing to do. It is a book that tells on itself. It is a book where the author gives himself away, perhaps inadvertently, but I would say on purpose. He knew it was going to go there. And that's what makes the book so riveting. Okay? It is painfully awkward at times because there are moments where he, at this time in his life when he's 18 or 19 years old, he just, appeals, I would say, to the absolute worst instincts in his fellow players and in his coaches, and gets absolutely slammed, okay? Here's this tremendously talented, tender soul, perhaps a bit repugnant. The character I'm saying at the beginning of the book, he's a bit full of himself and his talent. And you watch him just get the most terrible comeuppance. I don't think there's a single moment of effective self-denigrating humor in this book. I think one of the things about this book that makes it great, and I don't use that term lightly, is that he takes himself completely seriously, even as a 12-year-old. In fact, one of the few moments in the book that I think doesn't stand up is where he's 19 or 20 years old and he goes to a whorehouse, and you get the sense that Jordan is sort of self-disparagingly describing his naivete, and the scene doesn't come off. It's better when he kind of refuses to laugh at himself, and therefore we can't laugh at him either. There are times also in the book, he is just so perceptive about other people. And there's a kind of glee that you see in the way he exposes other people's hypocrisy. Is it revenge? I don't know. But there's a kind of cruelty to it. It's a pleasure to read nonetheless. There are very few people in this book, perhaps a coach, perhaps the daughter of another coach, perhaps Joe Torre, the famous manager and catcher. But even he gets a dig against Joe Torre, makes him look pathetic in one instance. I wouldn't say that he's most vicious on himself, but without a doubt, he takes all the blame for his failure. And the book is admirable in that way. It has to be the best, the most raw, the most unflinching treatise I've ever read on failure. And I've read a lot about that subject. And he's not beating his breast. He's just exposing himself in the most unsentimental way. He's just so honest about fucking up, about blowing this big chance. It's a shame in a way that it's about baseball because it kind of limits the extent that certain readers who don't know anything about baseball can enjoy it. That said, Pat Jordan does so much so well. The way he describes people, the way he describes landscapes, the way he describes ballparks, the way he describes the game of pepper, striking someone out, a barbecue that he had one day in the bullpen after a road trip coming back to Waycross, Georgia, about this one sweet stretch of success that he had in the minor leagues just before it all fell apart. The succinct way he can tell an anecdote, the heartbreaking way that he describes the career trajectories of his fellow players and coaches. And so we get to see like how much or how little talent or mental strength or hard work or eccentricities have in success, and how all that is heightened in athletic careers. Jordan so convincingly describes how much courage is required to live talent to the fullest, how nothing in it can be conceded, how few people can do that, how few of us are up to that. He wrote another memoir called A Nice Tuesday, which is about his comeback 35 years later after leaving baseball. He claims it's better. I don't agree with him. I don't think the book ever really lifts off. I don't think it's inspired. It's very good, but it depends upon, it wouldn't really exist without A False Spring. It's more ambitious. It tries to work in more themes, but no. I recommend it, I guess, but I definitely recommend. I could not recommend more A False Spring. In fact, before I would recommend A Nice Tuesday, the sequel, which he wrote in 1999, okay? It was published in 1999, I would recommend The Best Sports Writing of Pat Jordan, which came out in, I think, 2008. It was published by Persea Books or Persea Books. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Persea. It was curated, or the pieces were selected by a guy named Alex Belth, who is a fascinating character too, and a very good writer. He has something called, the Stacks Reader, where he curates. It's like a museum of great feature pieces. And Pat Jordan has written a bunch of those. He wrote a great piece on Steve Garvey, another one on Steve Carlton. He wrote a piece on Tom Seaver, one of the few great athletes that he respected. Another one on O.J. Simpson. I think I would recommend that book more than maybe A Nice Tuesday. Then again, Alex Belth, as I say, who curated the best sports writing of Pat Jordan, also agrees with Pat Jordan that A Nice Tuesday is a better book than A False Spring, but I disagree with them both. I think that A False Spring is one of those rare examples of books where the person had the guts to go in deep, right, and just see what came out of them. I can reread that book a million times, and I will never know how Pat Jordan did it. If I read, for example, A Nice Tuesday, I can kind of see how he consciously put that together. I can see how I can deconstruct it. I can see how it's done. Never will I be able to do that with A False Spring. It is a work of art, to the highest degree. Check it out.